Tessa Holloway slapped the man who saved her life hard enough that heads turned 3 storefronts down Black Prairie's main street. The crack of her palm against his jaw silenced the crowd that had gathered to watch her nearly tumble under the spooked wagon. Roscoe Crawford stood there, one hand still steadying her elbow from where he'd yanked her clear, the other loose at his side. He didn't flinch. His weathered face barely registered the impact, except for the slow tightening along his jaw. She stepped back, her chest heaving under the fitted bodice of her dark green dress. Dust from the wagon wheel streaked her hem. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins during the stumble, tendrils falling across her flushed face. Her eyes blazed with something raw and uncontained, something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with fury she couldn't name. He dropped his hand from her arm. His sun-faded brown coat hung open over a dark vest and worn shirt. His eyes, shadowed under the brim of his hat, studied her with the flat calm of a man who had survived worse than a woman's anger. He looked older than his years, lines carved deep by sun, and something harder. War, maybe. Loss, certainly. You had no right, she said, her voice shaking but audible to everyone watching. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The worn riding gloves she never took off in town creaked with the pressure. Roscoe tilted his head slightly. The crowd held its breath. A woman in a flour-dusted apron clutched her basket. 2 men in work shirts exchanged glances near the saloon steps. The driver of the spooked wagon stood frozen, reins still tangled in his grip. "Ma'am," Roscoe said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. His tone carried no anger, no defensiveness, just flat statement. "You were about to lose your head under that wheel." Tessa's jaw tightened. Her breathing steadied, but the fire in her eyes didn't dim. "I had it handled. You were falling. I was managing." He stepped back, giving her space the crowd clearly thought she didn't deserve. His boots scraped the dry, packed earth. He turned half away, ready to leave the scene, to let her have whatever dignity she thought the slap had purchased. But his eyes flicked once more to her face, lingering on something he saw there. Not the anger, something underneath it, something cornered. Tessa's hands shook. She folded her arms tight across her ribs, pressing down on the tremble. The watching crowd began to murmur. Someone laughed, low and mean. Someone else muttered about Eastern manners and frontier gratitude. She heard the words ungrateful and prideful and worse things, whispered just loud enough to sting. She turned on her heel and walked toward the edge of town where her small wagon waited. Her spine stayed rigid. Her stride didn't falter. But her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she knew every eye followed her retreat. Roscoe watched her go. He rubbed his jaw once, a slow, deliberate motion. Then he picked up his hat from where it had fallen in the dust during the rescue, knocked it twice against his leg, and settled it back on his head. He walked in the opposite direction, toward the land office at the far end of the street. No one stopped him. No one thanked him. That was fine. He hadn't come to Black Prairie for thanks. 2 hours later, Tessa stood in the small stone-walled office behind her orchard shed, staring at a ledger that refused to balance no matter how many times she recalculated the columns. The numbers blurred. Her hand still tingled from the slap. Shame crept up her throat, hot and bitter, but she swallowed it down with the stubbornness that had kept her alive this long. She shouldn't have done it. She knew that. But the moment his hand closed around her arm, The moment she felt herself pulled against a man's chest in front of half the town, something inside her had snapped. It didn't matter that he'd saved her. It didn't matter that the wagon wheel would have crushed her skull. All that mattered was the last time a man had touched her in public. He'd been promising to marry her while secretly draining her father's accounts. That betrayal had cost her everything. Her father's orchard, her reputation, her faith that any man could be trusted when his hands were on her. She closed the ledger with a snap. The debt hidden in those pages wasn't going away. The railroad surveyors nosing around Black Prairie weren't going away. And now the entire town had watched her slap a stranger for the crime of keeping her alive. Perfect. A knock rattled the shed door. She froze. Her pulse kicked up again. She smoothed her hair back, retied the loose ribbon, and opened the door expecting the banker or one of the town gossips. Instead, Roscoe Crawford stood on her threshold, hat in hand. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The evening light slanted gold across the orchard rows behind him. Apple trees heavy with late summer fruit stretched in neat lines. The air smelled of ripening sweetness and dry earth. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said before she could slam the door. His voice was still rough, still quiet. He looked tired. Dust from the road clung to his coat. "Then why are you here?" she said flatly. "Because I own the land next to yours now." He gestured, vaguely east, toward the failing stretch everyone called High Wind Ranch. "And because the land office clerk said if I wanted to know what I was stepping into, I should talk to the orchard keeper who's been fighting the railroad buyers for 6 months. Tessa's stomach dropped. She kept her face carefully neutral. "You're the new owner. Inherited it. Didn't know the man. Didn't expect the place. Just came to sign papers and move on. But you're staying." He hesitated. The pause stretched long enough that she saw the truth before he spoke it. He didn't know yet. He was deciding in real time, standing on her doorstep with his hat in his hands. "Depends," he said finally, "on whether it's worth staying." She should tell him to leave. She should close the door and let him figure out Black Prairie's tangled mess on his own. But something in his steady gaze, something in the way he didn't demand or cajole, made her step back and gesture him inside. He entered slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer interior. The office was small, shelves lined with jars of preserved fruit, a narrow desk cluttered with ledgers and correspondence, a single lantern unlit on the sill. "The railroad wants this whole valley," she said without preamble. "They're offering buyouts to anyone who'll sell. Some folks have taken the money. The ones who won't sell are getting pressured." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind that makes your fences fall down in the night. The kind that spooks your livestock. The kind that makes the bank suddenly remember debts you thought you had time to pay." His jaw tightened. He glanced at the closed ledger on her desk. "You're in debt. Everyone's in debt. The question is whether the railroad owns your creditor yet. And yours." She met his eyes. "Not yet. But soon." He turned the brim of his hat in his hands. A slow rotation. "Why not sell? Take the money. Start over somewhere easier." Her laugh came out sharp and bitter. "Because this is mine. Because I've bled into this soil. Because the last man who made me promises took everything my father built. And I'll be damned if I let strangers in suits finish the job." Roscoe studied her for a long moment. She saw something shift behind his eyes, some internal calculation adjusting. He set his hat on the edge of her desk. The gesture felt significant, though she couldn't say why. "I don't have much," he said quietly. "War took most of what I carried. Drifting took the rest. But I know how to work land. I know how to fix what's broken. And I know how to spot a fight worth staying for." Her throat tightened. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "This isn't your fight. Maybe not. But if I leave, the railroad gets high wind without a struggle. And if they get high wind, your orchard's surrounded." She hadn't thought of it that way. Or she had, but she'd pushed the thought down because she couldn't do anything about it. The ranch had been failing for years. She'd assumed whoever inherited it would sell immediately. "You'd stay," she said slowly. "You'd fight them." "I'd stay," he confirmed. "If you'll tell me what I'm up against." She looked at him. Really looked at him. "War veteran," the town gossip had whispered. "Drifter with no ties. A man who pulled women out from under wagon wheels and took slaps without flinching. A man whose hands looked scarred from hard work, but who stood in her tiny office like he knew how to hold ground." She picked up the ledger, opened it, showed him the numbers she'd shown no one else. "This is what you're up against," she said. "This is what they'll do to you too." They spent the next hour mapping the valley's vulnerabilities. Which ranchers had already sold? Which were wavering? Which families owed money to which banks? Roscoe asked sharp questions that told her he understood land politics better than most drifters would. She answered honestly, too tired to hedge, too desperate for an ally to play coy. When the light outside faded to deep blue, he straightened. His hand brushed hers as he reached for his hat. The contact lasted less than a second, but she felt the calluses, the roughness of someone who'd worked himself raw more than once. "I'll stay," he said. "We'll figure this out." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that a stranger with nothing to lose would stand beside her against men with money and maps and legal threats. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" He settled his hat on his head. His eyes, shadowed now in the dim room, held hers. "Because running's easier than standing. And I'm tired of easy." He left before she could respond. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk back down the dirt path toward the ranch property, his silhouette fading into the dusk. Crickets sang in the orchard. The evening air cooled against her skin. She touched her palm, the one that had struck him. It didn't tingle anymore. It just felt empty. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of wary proximity. Tessa saw Roscoe working the high-wind fence line, replacing rotted posts. She saw him on a ladder patching the ranch house roof. She saw him leading a borrowed horse to the barn, moving with the easy competence of someone who'd done this work 100 times before. He didn't come back to her office. He didn't wave when he saw her in the orchard. He just worked, steady and methodical, like a man who'd made a decision and intended to see it through. Black Prairie noticed. The town always noticed. Talk shifted from the scandalous slap to speculation about the war veteran who'd taken on a failing ranch next to the stubborn orchard keeper. Some folks said he was a fool. Some said he had a plan. Some said darker things. Things about a man and a woman alone on adjacent properties. Things that made Tessa's jaw clench when she overheard them at the dry goods store. On the 4th day, the railroad men came. 3 of them arrived in a black carriage that looked absurdly formal against Black Prairie's dusty streets. They wore suits too clean for the frontier. Their faces carried the smooth confidence of men who expected doors to open and objections to crumble. They went to High Wind first. Tessa watched from her orchard, her hands stilling on the apple she'd been inspecting for worm damage. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw Roscoe standing in his ranch yard, arms crossed, head shaking. The railroad men gestured. One of them pulled papers from a leather case. Roscoe didn't move. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. Then the men climbed back into their carriage and turned toward her property. Her heart kicked into a faster rhythm. She set down her harvest basket and walked to meet them at the property line. She didn't wait for them to knock. She planted herself in their path, hands on her hips, chin up. "Miss Holloway," the lead man said, tipping his hat with false courtesy. "We've made you a generous offer. We're here to discuss the terms." "I'm not selling," she said. "The market value of this land is about to drop significantly. You'd be wise to take our price while it's on the table. Then I'll be unwise." The second man, younger, with cold eyes, leaned forward. "There are ways to make stubborn people see reason, miss. Ways that don't involve polite conversations." "That's a threat," she said evenly. "That's a fact." The air between them tightened. She felt the weight of their stares, the calculation behind their polished facades. These weren't men who accepted no. These were men who crushed obstacles. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. Roscoe appeared, walking slowly across the boundary between their properties. He stopped beside her, not quite touching, but close enough that his presence registered as alliance. He said nothing. He just stood there, arms loose, eyes on the railroad men. The dynamic shifted. The lead man's smile thinned. The younger one's jaw tightened. "Mr. Crawford," the lead man said, "we just explained to you the futility of holding on to High Wind. Surely you don't intend to complicate Miss Holloway's situation as well." "I intend to stand on my land," Roscoe said quietly. "Same as she's standing on hers. You're making a mistake. Wouldn't be my first." The railroad men exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them. Then the lead man tipped his hat again, the gesture now edged with something colder. "We'll be back," he said, "when you've had time to reconsider." They climbed into the carriage. The driver snapped the reins. Dust rose as the wheels turned, carrying them back toward town. Tessa let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands trembled. She pressed them flat against her skirt. "Thank you," she said quietly. Roscoe glanced at her. "Didn't seem like you needed help." "I didn't. But it felt better not being alone." He nodded once. The silence between them stretched. Not uncomfortable, just heavy with things neither knew how to say. Finally, he turned back toward his property. "Crawford," she called. He paused, looked back. "Why are you really staying?" His expression shifted, something unguarded flashing across his weathered features before he locked it down. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he said. "Maybe I want to see what happens if I stand still." He walked away before she could ask what he was running from. That night, the storm rolled in with the kind of sudden violence the Prairie was known for. Tessa was in her small cabin at the orchard's edge when the first crack of thunder shook the walls. Rain followed, heavy and cold, drumming against the roof like fists. Wind howled through gaps in the window frame. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. She lit a lantern and checked the shutters. Secure. She checked the door. Latched. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders and tried to ignore the way the cabin creaked under the storm's assault. The knock came an hour later, barely audible over the rain. She froze. No one traveled in weather like this. No one sane, anyway. Another knock. Harder. She grabbed the iron poker from beside the cold stove and approached the door. "Who's there?" "Crawford. Your barn's got a hole in the roof. You're going to lose half your stored harvest if someone doesn't patch it now." She yanked open the door. Rain poured off the brim of his hat. His coat was soaked through. Water dripped from his sleeves. He looked half drowned and completely serious. "You came out in this," she said, incredulous. "Your barn's flooding." She grabbed her own coat and followed him into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways. Rain lashed her face. The world narrowed to mud and noise, and the solid shape of Roscoe ahead of her, pushing through the weather like he'd walked through worse. Maybe he had. They reached the barn. Inside, rain poured through a gap in the roof where shingles had blown loose. Water pooled on the floor, creeping toward the stacked crates of stored apples. Tessa's stomach lurched. That fruit represented months of work, her only chance at paying down the debt before the bank's deadline. "Ladder's over there," Roscoe shouted over the storm. "You hold it steady. I'll patch what I can." She wanted to argue. Wanted to say she could do it herself, that she didn't need his help, that accepting this would mean owing him something she couldn't afford to owe. But the water was rising, and the fruit was drowning, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She held the ladder. He climbed into the storm's teeth, hammer and nails and scrap wood tied to his belt. Rain hammered him. Wind tried to rip him off the roof. He wedged himself against the slope and worked with methodical determination, prying loose damaged shingles, nailing down patches, sealing gaps. Tessa held the ladder and watched him risk his neck for her harvest. Her throat tightened. Her hands ached from gripping the wet wood. She didn't let go. It took an hour. By the time he climbed down, they were both shaking from cold and exhaustion. The patch wasn't perfect, but it held. The rain inside the barn slowed to a drip. The stored fruit was safe. Roscoe leaned against the barn wall, chest heaving. His hat was long gone, lost to the wind. His hair was plastered to his head. He looked exhausted and soaked and utterly unbothered by any of it. Tessa stared at him. "Why did you do that?" He met her eyes. "Because it needed doing. You could have died up there." "Didn't." "That's not an answer." He pushed off the wall, took a step closer. Water dripped from both of them, pooling on the barn floor. Outside the storm still raged, but inside the space felt suddenly smaller, warmer, charged with something neither of them had invited. "I did it because you would have done it yourself," he said quietly. "And you would have fallen. And I'm tired of watching people fall when I can do something about it." Her breath caught. She saw it then, the thing beneath his steady calm. The wound he carried. The guilt. He was a war veteran who'd seen people fall and couldn't save them. He was a drifter who kept moving because standing still meant facing what he'd failed to protect. And he'd stopped running the moment he saw someone else about to lose everything. "I slapped you," she whispered. "I know. I was cruel. You were scared." Her eyes burned. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the day she discovered her fiancé's betrayal. But her chest felt tight and full, and something inside her was cracking. I can't trust men, she said. The words came out raw. The last one who touched me took everything. I'm not him, Roscoe said. I don't know that. No. You don't. He stepped back, giving her space she wasn't sure she wanted. But I'll keep showing up anyway. Until you do. He walked out into the storm, back toward his own property, leaving her standing in the barn with her saved harvest, and a heart that felt dangerously close to hoping. The next morning dawned clear and merciless. Tessa woke to the sound of hammering. She pulled on dry clothes and walked to the barn. Roscoe was already there, repairing the temporary patch with proper materials, making it permanent. He didn't look up when she approached, just kept working. His movements were efficient, practiced. His coat was still damp, but he'd found his hat, battered and mud-caked, but functional. She watched him for a moment. Then, she went back to the cabin and made coffee. When she returned with 2 tin cups, he finally paused. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cup. They drank in silence. The morning sun warmed the wet earth. Steam rose from puddles. The valley looked scrubbed clean, green and gold under a hard blue sky. "I need to tell you something," Tessa said. He waited. "I'm in debt to Thomas Garrett at the bank. He's been patient, but his patience is running out. The railroad's been talking to him. If I don't make a payment by the end of the month, he'll foreclose. And if he forecloses, I think the railroad's already arranged to buy the note. How much do you need?" She told him. His expression didn't change, but she saw the calculation in his eyes. It was more than a drifter would have, more than a failing ranch could produce in a month. "I can't get that much," he said slowly. "But I can buy you time." "How?" "By making noise. By filing complaints at the land office. By making it legally complicated enough that the railroad has to slow down." She wanted to ask why he'd do that, why he'd tie himself to her problems when he barely knew her. But she'd asked enough questions. At some point you either accepted help or you drowned alone. "There's something else," she said. "Something you should know." He turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention. "The man who betrayed me," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest, "was supposed to marry me. He courted me properly, publicly. My father approved. Everyone approved. And while we were planning the wedding, he was draining my father's accounts to cover gambling debts. By the time we discovered it, he was gone, and my father was ruined." Roscoe's jaw tightened. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. Somewhere far from consequences." She paused. "My father died 6 months later. Heart gave out. But I think it was really shame that killed him. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. Sorry doesn't pay debts." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "What are you running from?" He took a long breath, let it out slow. "War, mostly. Things I did, things I didn't do. Orders I followed, men I couldn't save." He stared into his coffee. "When it ended, I tried to go home. Couldn't. Everything I touched seemed to break. So I kept moving. Figured if I didn't stay anywhere long enough, I couldn't hurt anyone. But you stopped here." "Yeah." He looked at her, something raw and uncertain in his weathered face. "I did." "Why?" "Because you slapped me," he said quietly. "And you look like you'd fight the whole world before you'd let it take one more thing from you. and I thought, maybe that's someone worth standing next to. Her throat closed. She set down her coffee cup because her hands were shaking. No one had chosen her side in a long time. No one had looked at her stubbornness and anger and seen something worth defending. The railroad men will come back, she said. I know. They'll make it worse. Probably. You could still leave. Sell the ranch. Disappear. He smiled, just a faint twist of his mouth. I could. But I won't. Why not? Because I'm tired of running. And because proving your innocence means something. She frowned. I'm not innocent. I've got debts. I've got enemies. I've made mistakes. Not about the debts, he said. About being someone who deserves to keep what's hers. About being someone who doesn't get punished for trusting the wrong person once. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard. When she could see clearly again, he was still standing there, steady and solid, waiting for her to decide if she could let him stay. All right, she said. We fight. He nodded. We fight. The railroad escalated exactly as predicted. Over the next 2 weeks, fences on both properties were cut. Livestock wandered onto the road. A fire started in Roscoe's hay barn, small enough to catch early but clearly deliberate. The bank sent Tessa a letter moving her deadline up by 2 weeks. Black Prairie watched. Some folks offered quiet support. Most kept their distance, unwilling to risk railroad retaliation. The town split between those who thought the stubborn pair were fools and those who secretly hoped they'd win. Tessa and Roscoe worked side by side, repairing damage, documenting sabotage, filing complaints that went nowhere. They spoke less as the days passed, but moved around each other with growing familiarity. He learned where she kept her tools. She learned how he took his coffee. They didn't talk about the storm or the things they'd confessed. They just worked. Then, Thomas Garrett showed up at Tessa's cabin with news that changed everything. He arrived at dusk, alone, looking nervous. Tessa met him at the door, with Roscoe standing a few feet behind her. They'd started coordinating like that, instinctively covering each other's positions. Miss Holloway, Garrett said, removing his hat. Mr. Crawford, I need to speak with you both. Inside, Tessa said curtly. They gathered around her small table. Garrett set down a leather folder. His hands shook slightly. The railroad came to me 3 days ago, he said. They want to buy your debt, Miss Holloway. All of it. They offered me twice what you owe. And you're here to tell us you accepted, Tessa said flatly. No. Garrett met her eyes. I'm here to tell you I refused. Silence. Roscoe leaned forward. Why? Because my father built this bank to serve Black Prairie, not to feed vultures. Garrett's voice strengthened. The railroad's been buying up debts all over the territory, foreclosing on families who've worked this land for generations. I won't be part of it. Tessa's heart hammered. What does that mean for me? It means I'm extending your deadline. 6 months. No interest increase. She couldn't breathe. 6 months. Room to breathe. Time to recover. She looked at Roscoe and saw the same cautious hope she felt. There's a condition, Garrett continued. His nervousness returned. The railroad knows I refused them. They're going to come after the bank now. After me. I need allies. I need people willing to stand publicly against them. We're already doing that, Roscoe said. I need you to do more. I need you to organize the other holdouts. Form a coalition. Make noise. He looked between them. Make it costly enough that they give up and move on. Tessa exchanged a long look with Roscoe. She saw the question in his eyes. This was bigger than 2 properties. This was a fight that would make permanent enemies. A fight that could cost them everything. But it was also a chance to stop running. We'll do it, she said. Garrett sagged with relief. He left maps and documents, lists of holdouts and debts, evidence of railroad intimidation. When he left, Tessa and Roscoe sat at the table, surrounded by papers that represented a war neither of them had wanted, but both were ready to fight. This is going to get worse, Roscoe said quietly. I know. They'll come after us harder. Let them. He looked at her, something fierce and protective rising in his expression. If this goes wrong, you lose everything. If we don't fight, I lose everything anyway. She held his gaze. At least this way I go down swinging. A smile ghosted across his face, the first real one she'd seen. All right then. We organize. They worked through the night. 3 days later, they held a meeting at the church. 15 families showed up, more than Tessa had dared hope. Roscoe laid out the strategy. Document everything. File complaints. Refuse all buyout offers. Support each other when the railroad retaliated. Stay loud. Stay visible. Make it a public fight the railroad couldn't win quietly. The coalition formed. Fragile, but real. That night, riding back from town together, Tessa felt something shift. The fear was still there. The debt was still crushing. But she wasn't alone anymore. She glanced at Roscoe riding beside her, his profile shadowed under his hat brim, and felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. Thank you, she said. For what? For staying. He turned his head. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything, but something passed between them in the darkness. Something unspoken and powerful. Then, hoofbeats thundered behind them. Tessa's heart lurched. She twisted in the saddle. 3 riders, moving fast. Not the railroad men. These were rougher. Hired trouble. Go, Roscoe snapped. They kicked their horses into a run. The chase tore through the darkness. Tessa's horse stretched out beneath her, hooves pounding the dirt road. Roscoe stayed beside her, his face grim, his body low over his horse's neck. The pursuing riders gained ground. A shot cracked the air. Tessa flinched. The bullet went wide, but the message was clear. This wasn't intimidation. This was violence. Cut left, Roscoe shouted. They veered off the road into the open prairie. Rougher ground, riskier for the horses, but harder for the pursuers to surround them. They rode hard for 10 minutes before the sound of pursuit faded. They slowed finally, both horses lathered and blowing hard. Tessa's hands shook on the reins. Her whole body vibrated with adrenaline and terror. You all right? Roscoe asked, his voice rough. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They're escalating, he said grimly. This isn't sabotage anymore. I know. You need to leave Black Prairie. Tonight. Go somewhere safe until this is over. She turned on him, fury replacing fear. I'm not running. They just shot at you. They shot at us. And I'm not leaving. Tessa, this isn't pride anymore. This is survival. Exactly. Her voice shook, but held firm. And I survived by standing, not by running. Not anymore. He stared at her. Then slowly, he nodded. All right. But we don't ride alone anymore. And we arm ourselves. Agreed. They rode back together, slower now, watching the darkness. When they reached the boundary between their properties, Tessa didn't want to separate. She didn't want to go back to her empty cabin. Didn't want to lie awake listening for hoofbeats. Stay, she said quietly. Just tonight. On the porch. I'll feel safer knowing you're there. He hesitated, then nodded. I'll stay. She unsaddled her horse and went inside. He settled on the porch with his rifle across his knees. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the creak of wood as he shifted position, keeping watch. She fell asleep feeling safer than she had in months. The coalition held for 2 weeks. Then the railroad made its next move. They didn't attack properties. They attacked reputations. Rumors started spreading through Black Prairie. Whispers about Tessa and Roscoe. About improper conduct. About a woman living alone next to a man with no ties. About nighttime visits and closed doors. The gossip was vicious and calculated, designed to isolate them from the community they were trying to organize. Tessa heard the whispers at the dry goods store, saw the way women pulled their children away from her, felt the weight of judgment in every public space. It shouldn't have hurt. She'd faced worse. But it did hurt, sharp and deep, because it was designed to make her ashamed of the one good thing she'd found in months. The one person who'd chosen to stand beside her. Roscoe heard it too. She saw the tension in his shoulders when they met at the property line. They're trying to split us, he said. I know. If I leave, the talk stops. If you leave, I'm alone again. She met his eyes. I'd rather have the scandal. Something shifted in his expression. He stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. I don't care what they say. Neither am I. Good. They stood like that for a long moment. Close enough to touch, but not touching. The air between them felt electric. She wanted to close the distance. Wanted to feel his hands on her. Wanted to stop being afraid of wanting. But footsteps approached. They stepped apart as one of the coalition members appeared. Looking shaken. They took my cattle, the man said. Whole herd. Said it was payment for an old debt I don't even owe. Roscoe's jaw tightened. Show me the paperwork. The coalition met again that night. Tensions ran high. 2 families announced they were selling. They couldn't take the pressure anymore. Tessa couldn't blame them, but each loss weakened their position. We need something big, she said. Something that forces the railroad to back off. Roscoe frowned, thinking. The land grants. The original territorial claims. If we can prove the railroad survey maps are fraudulent, their whole buyout strategy falls apart. Where do we get proof? The territorial office. But it's 3 days' ride. And we'd need someone who can read legal documents. Tessa straightened. I can read them. My father taught me bookkeeping and contracts. Then we go, Roscoe said. Tomorrow. They left before dawn. 3 days on the trail. 3 days alone together. Tessa packed light. and tried not to think about what it meant that she trusted him enough to ride into the wilderness with him. The first day passed in steady travel. They talked little, saving energy for the miles. That night they made camp in a sheltered canyon. Roscoe built a fire. Tessa made coffee from their provisions. They sat on opposite sides of the flames, close enough to share warmth but far enough to maintain propriety that didn't matter anymore. Not after all the rumors. "Tell me about the war," she said quietly. He stared into the fire. Took a long time to answer. "It was ugly. We did ugly things, told ourselves it was necessary. Maybe it was. Doesn't make it easier to live with. Do you regret it? Every day. But regret doesn't undo it. So I keep moving. Or I did. Until now. What changed?" He looked at her across the fire. "You did. You made staying worth the wait." Her breath caught. She wanted to go to him. Wanted to close the distance and let herself feel what she'd been fighting since the day she slapped him. But fear still held her back. Fear that trusting him would end the way trust always ended, with betrayal and loss. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "I know. I don't know how to stop being afraid." "You don't have to stop." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You just have to trust me anyway." She stood, walked around the fire, sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He went very still. Then slowly, carefully, he put his arm around her. She leaned into him, let herself feel safe. Let herself believe that maybe this time would be different. They sat like that until the fire burned down to embers. The second day they rode through higher country. The third day they reached the territorial office. What they found in the dusty records changed everything. The railroad survey maps didn't match the original land grants. Whole sections had been redrawn. Property lines shifted. The fraud was blatant once you knew where to look. Tessa copied everything. Her hands cramped from writing, but she didn't stop. This was the proof they needed. This would force the railroad to fight in court instead of in the shadows. They started back that afternoon, riding hard. If they could get the documents to Garrett and the coalition before the railroad realized what they'd found, they had a chance. They were 2 hours from Black Prairie when they saw the smoke. Roscoe reined in hard. His face went white. That's coming from the valley. They kicked their horses into a desperate run. The smoke rose from High Wind Ranch. Not the house. The barn. The big barn where Roscoe had been storing the fall harvest he'd managed to salvage. The crop that was supposed to give him capital to hold on through winter. Flames roared. Heat shimmered. Black smoke poured into the evening sky. Tessa's blood turned to ice. This wasn't sabotage. This was message. This was punishment for going to the territorial office. People from town had gathered, bucket brigade forming, but the fire was too fierce. The barn was lost. Roscoe dismounted and stood staring at the inferno. His face was carved from stone. Everything he'd worked for, burning. Then, someone screamed. "There's someone inside." Tessa's heart stopped. She grabbed Roscoe's arm. "Who?" "Who's inside?" "One of the railroad men," someone shouted. "Saw him go in right before the fire started. Think he was setting it and got trapped." Roscoe didn't hesitate. He ran toward the burning barn. "No," Tessa screamed. She ran after him, terror flooding her veins. The heat hit her like a wall. Flames licked out through the doorway. The structure groaned, roof timbers starting to fail. Roscoe plunged inside. Tessa stood frozen, unable to breathe, watching the doorway where he'd disappeared. Seconds stretched into eternity. The barn shifted, a massive timber crashing down inside. Then Roscoe emerged, half carrying, half dragging the railroad man. Both were coughing, smoke-blackened, singed. Roscoe's coat was on fire. Someone threw a bucket of water over him. He collapsed to his knees, still gripping the man he'd saved. The barn collapsed behind them with a roar that shook the ground. Tessa reached him, dropped beside him. Her hands shook as she checked him for injuries. Burns on his hands, smoke in his lungs, but alive. Alive. "You idiot," she choked out. "You stupid, reckless, impossible idiot." He coughed, managed a rough laugh. Couldn't let him die. He was burning your barn. Still couldn't let him die. She wanted to hit him, wanted to kiss him, wanted to scream. Instead, she just held him while the barn burned and the townspeople stared, and the railroad man he'd saved coughed and retched and lived. The sheriff arrived, took statements. The railroad man confessed everything under the weight of witnesses and his own guilt at nearly dying. The arson, the intimidation, the orders from his employers. By midnight, warrants had been issued. The railroad's local agents fled. The fraud documents Tessa carried suddenly had official backing. Black Prairie turned. What had been a quiet battle became a public scandal. The railroad had overplayed its hand. Roscoe's rescue became the story everyone told. The war veteran who saved the life of the man trying to destroy him. The coalition strengthened. More families joined. Garrett's bank stood firm. The territorial governor sent investigators. Within 2 weeks, the railroad withdrew its buyout campaign. The legal costs and public relations disaster were too high. They moved their route 20 miles south, bypassing Black Prairie entirely. It was over. Tessa stood in her orchard at sunrise, watching the light turn the valley gold. Her debt was manageable now. Her harvest was secure. Her property was hers. Footsteps approached. She didn't have to turn to know it was Roscoe. He stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. His hands were still bandaged from the fire. He'd lost his barn and most of his harvest. But he was smiling. "We won," he said quietly. "You nearly died, but we won." She turned to face him. The sunrise lit his weathered face, caught the gold in his brown eyes. He looked tired and scarred and absolutely certain. "Why did you save him?" she asked. "After everything they did." "Because you made me want to be someone worth staying for," he said. "And that man, whoever he is, he's not that person if I let someone burn." She reached up and cupped his face. He went very still. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and careful, tasting smoke and hope and earned trust. He kissed her back like she was something precious, something worth every mile he'd run and every fight he'd stood for. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I'm still afraid," she whispered. "So am I," he admitted. "But I'm not running anymore. Neither am I." "Stay," she said. "Not on your land. Here, with me. Make this work." He smiled, the expression transforming his whole face. "I already planned to. if you'd have me." She kissed him again. The sunrise warmed the valley. Somewhere in town, church bells rang. The orchard rustled in the morning breeze. They stood together on land they'd fought for, beside each other by choice, no longer running from the past, but building something new. Tessa Holloway had slapped the man who saved her life. And he'd stayed anyway. He'd stood beside her through fire and fear and scandal. He'd proven that trust could be earned, that staying could be braver than leaving. She looked at Roscoe Crawford, war veteran and drifter-turned-rancher. The man who'd taught her that sometimes the right person makes you want to stop running and start building. "We should get married," she said. "Make it official. Make it clear." He laughed, surprised and delighted. "Is that a proposal?" "It's a practical solution." His eyes danced. "You're terrible at romance. So are you. That's why we work." He pulled her close. "When?" "Soon. Before winter. Before anything else can go wrong." "Nothing's going wrong," he promised. "Not anymore." She believed him. And that was the biggest change of all. The wedding happened 3 weeks later in the church, where they'd organized the coalition. Half of Black Prairie attended. The other half sent gifts anyway, unwilling to miss being part of the story. Tessa wore her mother's dress, altered to fit. Roscoe wore a new shirt and his best coat. They stood before the minister and made promises they both intended to keep. When he kissed her, the church erupted in cheers. They walked out into the October sunshine as husband and wife. The orchard waited. The ranch waited. A life waited, built on hard-won trust and the stubborn refusal to run. Roscoe took her hand. "Ready?" Tessa smiled. She looked at the man who'd saved her twice, once from a wagon wheel and once from loneliness. The man who'd stood when it mattered. The man who'd taught her that earned trust was worth every risk. "Ready," she said. They walked toward home together, no longer running, finally still.